Alright, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Fallen Flags America. I'm your host, L&N Productions. So we start off with a picture here. We analyze it every episode. Different place, different railroad, all the time. So here we have from, what is the date on this picture? 6/30/1972. We have a C&O freight crossing the L&N Diamond at Winchester, Kentucky. Now, for those that don't know, the C&O had a branch that went from the main line at just a few miles east of Ashland, Kentucky, and it connected with the main line, and it went west to Lexington, where it connected with the Southern and the L&N. I'll leave a link to that video in the description, just in case you missed it. So this is a glorious picture. One, we have a pair of SD40s on this train with number 7503 leading and a semaphore signal here and a beautiful station building. Unfortunately, from what I've heard, the C&O tracks to where this is at have been demolished. Not demolish or move because you can't demolish tracks. The station, I do believe it was either demolished or moved, although I'm not for sure on that. The platforms I do know are still there. I think the station building served as like an office building for another business till sometime in the mid 2010s, I think. I'm not really for sure on that. Anyways, let's get into the video. So, that's not what I wanted to do. So, we are going to discuss the George Washington's Railroad, known as the C&O Railway. Like the Wabash, the C&O was formed from several different mergers through its years. Anyway, the C&O Railway was one of several Appalachian coal haulers and is perhaps the best remembered for its marketing sensation, the Chessie sleeping kitten, as well as its buyout of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad during the early 1960s. So for those who don't know, the C&O and the B&O, which were by the mid-60s, they were sister railroads. They never officially merged until 1973 when they formed the Chessie system, which was composed of the C&O, the B&O, and the Western Maryland, as well as the Pierre Marquette, but that's really a different video because the Pierre Marquette was merged into the C&O in 1947. Anyway, an icon even outside the rail industry, many people still recognize the kitten and its association with railroading in some way. The C&O's earliest history traces back to the early 19th century when Virginia was first building railroads. It was granted its current name in the 1870s, upon which it grew into a coal hauling juggernaut similar to the nearby Norfolk and Western Railroad. I'll do a video on that sometime in the future. In addition to excellent management throughout much of the 20th century, the company earned substantial profits even during the industry's turbulent years of the 1960s and 70s. It thrived on West Virginia and Kentucky coal and was a gateway between Chicago and ports of Virginia. Today, much of the remaining C&O network is operated by CSX. So here we have a picture of a C&O E8A number 4029 as power of the westbound George Washington as it departs from a ferry terminal in Newport News, Virginia during October of 1968. Also notice the old Chevrolet, I think it's a Ford F100 to the right. I like to point out small details like that. While the C&O Railway of the 20th century was a highly profitable and successful operation, it took many years before reaching that plateau. The railroad's ancestry can be traced all the way back to the James River Company. a canal operation which opened in 1790 between Richmond and Westham, Virginia. It later became the James River and Kanawha Canal. Unfortunately, by the time of its remaining canal transportation, was fast being replaced by the more efficient railroad. The C&O's earliest predecessor, the Lusa Railroad, incorporated on February 8, 1836 by Virginia General Assembly to open a 22-mile route from Fredericks Hall to Taylorsville, today known as Doswell, where a connection was established with the north-south Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, which, fun fact, survived as its own independent railroad until the mid-80s when it was merged with CSX. From the start, the system had a relatively strong financial backing and wasted no time completing its charter, opening in December of 1837. Here's a rundown of the C&O's famous trains. They really only have 3 famous trains. Oh, I'm sorry, there is actually 4. They have the Fast Flying Virginian, or FFV, which was a Washington to Newport News to Cincinnati to Louisville train. So it ran trackage rights from Cincinnati to Louisville via the L&N. The George Washington, which was a Washington to Newport News to Cincinnati to Louisville, again under L&N trackage rights. The Chessie, which was a planned train to be launched in the late 1940s to early 50s, that was going to be powered by the C&O's M1s, but those turned out to be a huge disappointment for the C&O. They even had streamlined 484 Hudsons that they rebuilt from their older Pacifics, which the class name of those escapes me at the moment. But this train was never launched because the C&O just didn't want to do it. I'll just say that because I don't know the real reason. But Pierre Marquette, which was a Detroit, Michigan to Grand Rapids, Michigan to Chicago to Grand Rapids to Muskegon, and Detroit back to Saginaw, Michigan. And finally, the Resort Special originally served Chicago and Portsky, but later connected Washington with White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. And finally, the Sportsman, which was a Washington to Newport News to Cincinnati to Detroit train. Here's the famous C&O for Progress logo. The Virginia Commonwealth of the early 19th century was a forward-thinking state and a big proponent of railroads. Realizing their potential in opening trade and economic opportunities not only with its own borders but also beyond. Its Piedmont region could also supply diverse types of agriculture, which persists through today, and the Lusa was utilized by farmers to ship their products to market. In 1850, the company was renamed Virginia Central, as promoters eyed expansion across the state and even farther west. According to Thomas Dixon Jr.'s C&O Railway, a concurse history and fact book, the road's ultimate goal was to reach the Shenandoah Valley in what is today the state of West Virginia, then Western Virginia. It also saw the potential and a direct link to Richmond despite protestations from the RF&P, which now viewed the VC as a rival. The RF&P's efforts were in vain as the VC reached the state capital the same year it acquired its new name. So here we see another picture, this time of, let's see here, 4 GP7s with C&O 5805 leading the light engine move. These are currently idling at Gladstone, Virginia. on an overcast October day, being October 26, 1969. The C&O was kind of interesting because the Jeep 7s and the Jeep 9s, most of them never made it to C&O paint, not C&O chassis paint per se, but they did survive into the chassis years and were retired, I think, in the 1983 to 84, I think. Although a handful of them made it to CSX, although they didn't serve but maybe 2 or 3 years. Um, but C&O had mainly two paint schemes if the Jeep 7s could be seen. Well, three paint schemes they could be seen in. They could be seen in the just standard blue and yellow with the C&O, what I call the text lettering. Then they had the the Chesapeake and Ohio lettering, which would have been on the sides of the unit, with the C&O for progress on the front and back of the unit. And that was really about it. They would sometimes have variations of that paint scheme where the number would be on the side instead of the cab, whilst this leader, for instance, it has it on the cab, just in case you missed it. In 1857, the VC expanded as far as Jackson's River Station near present-day Clifton Forge, via Gordonsville, Charlottesville, and Staunton, offering it a network of around 192 miles. Even before the Lhasa Railroad had been renamed, the state stepped in to assist its future westward expansion by chartering the Blue Ridge Railroad in 1849 to tackle the Blue Ridge Mountains. This line's most impressive engineering feat was the Blue Ridge Tunnel, also known as the Crozet Tunnel, designed by engineer Claudius Crozet. It was located at Rockfish Gap and spanned 4,237 feet, opening for service in 1858. The bore became a historic civil engineering landmark and remained in use until 1942, when the C&O opened a new tunnel to replace the original. The Blue Ridge Railroad was leased by the VC in 1858 as it looked to finally reach Covington. Unfortunately, the Civil War broke out in 1861 and further construction ceased. But Virginia Central was a vital asset for the Confederacy during the conflict because it was heavily damaged by both sides. After hostilities ended in May of 1865, crews needed until January 23rd to get the road back in service. So here are some samples of the C&O's timetables in 1940. Again, these are very nice prints. On July 1st, 1867, the VC finally reached Covington, although the war's devastation meant funds were exhausted to continue further construction. Its only other growth during this time was acquiring the assets of the Covington, Ohio Railroad, which had partially completed a route to the Ohio River along a stagecoach line originally surveyed by James River and Kewanee Canal. In 1868, the Virginia Central was renamed as the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway to further clarify its intentions of reaching the Ohio River and the Chesapeake Bay. Enter Collius Huntington, who is best remembered for his work in building the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1869, just after the project was completed, Huntington pumped new life into the C&O by funding its push towards the west. The railroad followed the Covington, Ohio's routing, reaching Receiverdert along the banks of the Greenbrier River before turning north to Hilton. The town lay within the beautiful New Gorge, and rails snaked their way along the riverway until reaching Gailey Bridge, where it became the Kewanee River. So here's another picture, a set of weathered SD40-2s go over the Southern Diamond at Charlottesville, Virginia, in March 8, 1969. The C&O would only exist for another 4 years before it was merged with the B&O and WM as the Chesapeake and Ohio. Well, I'm sorry, the Chessie system. I am getting my stuff mixed up. I apologize. It is interesting the C&O chose to carry a slogan, George Washington's Railroad, when our nation's first president had no direct ties to the company and died more than 3 decades before its first predecessor was ever chartered. It all began with the James River Company, envisioned by Washington in 1785 as an efficient transportation artery to connect eastern and western Virginia at the Ohio River. He planned the canal system himself by using the James River across much of the state's eastern and central regions before picking up others, such as the Kawana and New Rivers, to reach the Ohio. It opened its first 7 miles between Richmond and Westham, Virginia, in 1790. It was built no further during Washington's life, but did see a bit of commercial traffic until its acquisition by the state in 1820. In 1835, it was reincorporated as the James River and Canal Company, reaching Bokanan by 1851. This proved the extent of its network due to increasing competition from the railroad. Here in this picture, before the C&O and B&O merged, the two interchanged at Canova, West Virginia, near Huntington, where the former's main line met the latter's Ohio River branch here. B&O steamers can be seen to the left, while C&O Jeep 9s hustle a coal drag in a scene that probably dates back to the 1950s. So again, this is probably the last stand of steam on the B&O, because B&O began retiring their steam engines in the mid-50s, along with most other railroads, with a few exceptions, but that's another video. In 1878, the right-of-way was sold to the Richmond and Allegheny Railroad, which began construction in 1880 along the canal's old towpath. According to Laura Archimage's article, Richmond and Allegheny Railroad. It completed a 230.31-mile route between the Chesapeake and Ohio at Richmond to Clifton Forge in 1881, as well as the 19.38-mile branch to Lexington via Balcony Falls. The C&O fell into receivership in 1883 and emerged on May 20, 1889 as the Richmond and Allegheny Railway, upon which time it was acquired by the C&O. The company purchased it outright on January 20th, 1890. The Chessie had been eyeing a more direct line across the state and got it in the R&A's low-grade route, making it an ideal to handle heavy tonnage such as coal. In addition, the route's canal history and ties to Washington allowed the C&O a bit, albeit somewhat indirectly, to claim a heritage to our nation's first president. Today, the corridor remains heavily used by CSX. This is a map of the C&O as of 1946. So you can see it had trackage all the way to Michigan, and trackage, I'm trying to see what state that is. That is, well, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, I don't really know where that's at. Anyhow, the route continued its way into Charleston, the future capital of West Virginia, before turning away near St. Albans and terminating at the Ohio River near the mouth of the Big Sandy River. The latter location became the town of Huntington, named for the tycoon himself. It would eventually become the location of the railroad's first major locomotive maintenance and repair shops. The C&O completed at Hawks Nest, West Virginia, along New River Gorge, January 29, 1873. Unfortunately, that year coincided with a severe recession as a result of the financial panic, and the C&O struggled to remain solvent. Huntington intended to use the railroad as a means of piecing together a true transcontinental railroad, but the economic downturn was too great, and the C&O fell into receivership in 1878. Fortunately, it was soon reorganized as the C&O Railway, setting the stage for what became a highly profitable system. During June of 1879, Huntington formed the Newport News in Mississippi to complete a route from Ashland to Lexington, Kentucky. So this is where the C&O's history of being in Kentucky comes in 1879. Here we see another C&O E8. C&O E8A number 4028 has the Newport News section of the George Washington at the ferry slip in Newport News on December 21st, 1979. This is a former Pierre Marquette E8A, as it is painted with Pierre Marquette blue and silver. It's just got the C&O patch on it. Again, a small detail, just in case you missed it. The NM and VY ran from the C&O at Mount Salvage, about 25 miles southwest of Ashland, to a connection with the Elizabeth Lexington Big Sandy Railroad at Mount Sterling, Kentucky. The Elizabeth Lexington Big Sandy Railroad continued on into Lexington and was acquired by Huntington. Through service between Ashland and Lexington commenced during December of 1881, while trackage rights over the Louisville-Nashville Railroad enabled the C&O to reach Louisville. That same year, the C&O pushed rails eastward into Newport News, finally providing it an East Coast port. Huntington had managed to maintain control of the railroad even after its bankruptcy until 1888, when, according to Mike Schaefer's More Classic American Railroads, he lost out to Cornelius Vanderbilt of New York Central fame and J.P. Morgan. A new ownership was for the best. While Huntington had funded the C&O's continued expansion, he spent a little on upgrading the company to modern standards. A new management team did just that, and by the turn of the 20th century, it was posed to be a very successful enterprise. Here we see another picture of a C&O SW7 number 5218 with a running light with a C&O caboose through the east end of Rockwell Yard in Chicago as a GP30 idles during a cold January day in 1965. In the meantime, he spent the rest of the century continuing to grow with a near limitless cash flow. On December 25, 1888, the C&O opened service to Cincinnati, Ohio, following the southern bank of the Ohio River via Ashland, Augusta, and Covington, Kentucky. It blossomed into a major coal carrier at this time, adding branches across southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Here, an important connection was also made with the Clinchfield Railroad at Elkhorn City, Kentucky, to tap new mines, a process that continued through 1920. The railroad spent heavily to improve bridges, update tunnels, and position itself to handle the increased traffic demands for years to come. It constructed shop and/or yard complexes at Charlottesville, Gladstone, and Clifton Forge, Virginia. Hamley, West Virginia, and Russell, Kentucky, were also two places where it constructed major yards and shops. In 1891, the C&O obtained trackage rights over the Virginia-Maryland Railroad between Orange and Washington, D.C., which provided a key connection to the nation's capital. The VMRR would soon become a subsidiary of the new Southern Railway system. Much of the C&O's growth during the 20th century through acquisition and not new construction. Here we see the C&O Chessie logo with kittens nip and tuck. The creator of Chessie, the famous kitten. The creator of the sleeping kitten image was an artist by the name of Guido Greenwald, who created the cute feline to promote animal kindness. In 1933, Lionel Probert, who headed the C&O's public relations and marketing department, saw Glenwood's Pierce and was instantly drawn to its potential. At the time, Probert was looking for a new way to showcase the railroad's new air-conditioned sleeping coaches, while also revitalizing sagging patronage. He purchased Glenwood's rendering for $5, came up with the name Chessie, nicknamed after the railroad, and added the slogan, "Sleep like a kitten and wake up fresh as a daisy," in an air cushion comfort. The C&O's first advertisement appeared in Fortune magazine's September 1933 issue and was an instant success. By 1934, the C&O had appeared in more than 4,000 pieces of media, from news to calendars. Here we see Pete, the father cat, to Chessie, the kitten, nicknamed Chessie's old man. The company's passenger traffic soared, and advertising campaign remains one of the most successful of all time. Even today, the C&O Railway Historical Society, or the C&O RHS, continues to sell calendars and other memorabilia featuring Chessie. When the kitten debuted, demand was so high that the C&O could not keep merchandise in stock. The kitten's success resulted in two additional mascots joining in, Nip and Tuck, as well as father cat named Peek. The three additional felines continued to appear in advertisements through 1948. Of course, Chessie's celebrity status did not end with merchandise and advertising. The kitten became synonymous with the C&O. Her celebrity was renegated in the early 1970s with the Chessie System, a holding company for the C&O, B&O, and Western Maryland, overlaid the kitten's shaloodle in the Chessie System C, adorning the railroad's new vermilion, yellow, and blue locomotives. The C&O's George Washington arrives at the station in Alexandria, Virginia on April 12, 1969, with a pair of ex-Pierre Marquette E-8As leading the George Washington on this April afternoon. The C&O eyed a connection to Chicago as traffic surged, and it found it in the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville Railroad. The CC&L entered receivership in 1908 and was acquired by the C&O on June 23rd. This railroad, covering 284.5 miles between Cincinnati and Hammond, Indiana, gave Chessie direct access into the Windy City, thanks to friendly trackage rights with other lines. The CC&L, which became the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway of Indiana, ran via Richmond, Muncie, and Purdue, cutting diagonally across the state. It allowed C&O and C&O's other diverse freight to flow both east and west, while reaching the most important gateway in the country in the process. Looking beyond Chicago, the company's leadership worked its way further into the Midwest, also in 1910, and acquired the Hooking Valley Railway, which stretched from Toledo to Athens to Jackson, Gallipolis, and Pomeroy, Ohio via Columbus. At first, the C&O received trackage rights over the N&W to reach the discontinued subsidiary via Limestone, Kentucky, and Valley Crossing, Ohio. However, by 1927, it had completed its own connection and now had a through route across the Buckeye State. The railroad formally merged the HV into its network in 1930. Here we see one of the C&O's M1s, as mentioned, number 500, during its trials in 1947. The locomotive was meant to be the streamliner Chessie, ultimately never launched, in an attempt to provide that advancements in steam technology could still compete against the new diesel locomotive. It was just over 140 feet long with a top speed of 100 miles per hour. Unfortunately, Baldwin, Westinghouse, and C&O engineers could not work out the numerous troubleshooting issues and gave up on the M1. For those who don't know, the M1s were riddled with issues. That's why the chassis was never launched, because the locomotive that was going to power it was far too unreliable. During the mid-1920s, the C&O was acquired by Van Sworrington Brothers of Cleveland, Ohio, who expanded its reach into Michigan and far east as Buffalo via Ontario, Canada, thanks to control of the Pierre Marquette. It also maintained authority over the Nickel Plate Railroad for many years. Following the Great Depression, chassis success only increased. Sustained by strong coal earnings, it weathered the 1930s rather easily, a decline which saw birth of chassis, a marketing sensation. Throughout the rest of the C&O's life, it would earn healthy profits, and in the early 1960s won a bidding war with the Illinois Central for control of its much larger northern neighbor, the B&O. The merger was approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) on December 31st, 1962, meaning it was approved on Christmas. However, rather than merge the B&O out of existence, the railroad chose to gradually combine the two, slowly merging departments and other management areas. This was done for several reasons, but two of the most important was to perpetuate the extremely loyal B&O employees, which would not take outright control and dissolution easily, and retain its tax implement status within the state of Maryland. The original painting of the C&O's chassis, the Sleeping Kitten. In 1972 came the largest change for the three railroads, including the B&O-controlled Western Maryland, when a new holding company was created, the Chessie System. Its new livery with the Chess C was an instant hit and remains one of the most colorful, popular, and dynamic liveries ever applied to a locomotive. The new chassis system would become quite a juggernaut, earning substantial profits throughout the 1970s, one of only a handful to do so during the darkest days of the industry's history. The chassis system, however, would last a mere 8 years as an independent company. In 1980, the chassis roads and those of the Family Line / Seaboard Coastline Industries Seaboard System, which was a holding company for a number of southeastern railroads, including the Seaboard Coastline, the Louisville-Nashville, McClinchville Railroad, and the Western Railroad of Alabama, formed CSX Corporation on November 1st, 1986. So the C&O rostered quite an interesting roster. They rostered 4 Alco C630s, all of which were built in 1967. They rostered 58 Alco S2s built from 1946 to 1950. They rostered 14 Alco S4s, which were built in 1953, 2 RS1s, 1953, 2 RS2s, 1949, which was the earlier version of the RS1, 26 RSD5s, 22 RS3s. The RSD5s were built in 1952 to 1953, the RS3s in 1955, the RSD7s in 1956, with 12 of them being on the roster, RSD12s, with 10 of those being built in 1956. They rostered a handful of Baldwin locomotives, with the rare AS616s, the C&O rostering 39 of these, being built in 1950 to 1953, and the Baldwin DRS 66 1500, with 3 of these being built in 1949. They were a favorite among EMD locomotives, with them rostering 14 BL2s built in 1948 to 1949, 4 E7As built in 1948, 25 GP15Ts built in 1982, 19 SD18s built in 1963, 41 NW2s built in 1948 to 1949, 48 GP, I'm sorry, that was 41, not 48, 48 GP30s built in 1962 to 1963, 38 GP35s built in 1964, 50 GP40s built in 1971, 60 GP38s built in 1969 to 1967 to 1970, 20 GP39s built in 1969, which are a very rare EMD, 31 E8As built in 1951 to 53, a whopping 95 GP40-2s built in 1972 to 1980, 26 SW7s built in 1950, 45 SW9s built in 51 to 53, 176 GP7s built in 50 to 53, 363 GP9s built in 54 to 57, 4 TR4s, these being cow-calf sets, built in 1950, 6 TR3s, with these being cow-calf sets, 86 F7As built in 1950 to 1952, 12 SD35s built in 1964, 63 SD40s built in 66 to 71, 16 FP7s built in 1952, and 43 SD50s built in 84 to 85. The SD50 was notorious for being a failed locomotive. They did not really like General Electrics that much, although they did roster a handful of General Electrics, and it doesn't include the B30-7s that they operated during the Chessie years. They had 10 U-23Bs built in 1969, 38 U-25Bs built in 63 to 64, 13 U-30Cs built in 1967 to 68. These are short-lived because they were retired in the mid-70s on the Chessie. 30 U-30Bs built in 72 to 74. And their steam roster includes, this is everything they rostered. They rostered 442 Atlantics, 210-2 Santa Fe or Texan types, 080, 660, and 010 switchers, an 04440T Shays, 462 Hudson locomotives or F-15 class, 280 consolidations, 2662 mallets, 2882s articulated, 26666 Alleghenies, 482 Mountains, 484 Greenbriers, 282 Mikados, 284 Kiwanis, 464 Hudsons, these being the L1s and the L2s, steam, 2 C1 plus 2 minus C1 minus B, steam turbines or M1s, and 2 10-4 Texans, these being T1s. Here's a picture of a C&O coal train. It was Black Diamonds was made the Chessie so successful. Here in the Chessie era, G40-2 4322 leads a long coal train at Moss Run, Virginia, while passing empties in November of '81. The creation of CSX entered the C&O into its last of many long and stored chapters. Eventually, a new subsidiary known as CSX Transportation was formed to operate the two roads. According to Trains magazine, the WM was the first to disappear, merged into the B&O on May 1st, 1983. The B&O survived until April 1st, 1987, when it merged into the C&O. Finally, the C&O was dissolved as a corporate entity on August 31st, 1987. Fun fact, being dissolved on oh, that's August. My bad. Um, Today, large segments of the old C&O remain in use, including its main line from Newport News to Cincinnati, as well as segments into northern Ohio via Columbus and Toledo. Unfortunately, most of its route to Chicago has been abandoned in favor of the B&O line, and the segment to Lexington is no longer part of the network, with it being closed in the late 80s. In addition, most of the PR Marquette trackage has either been abandoned or sold. The C&O Railway will always be remembered for an excellent railroad it operated throughout much of the 20th century, and Chessie the Kitten remains beloved by millions decades since the railroads disappeared. So there you go, guys. That's the story about the Chessie. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like. That helps out the channel. And go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell while you're at it. YouTube sometimes unsubscribes people, so make sure that you check that you're subscribed. If you want to unsubscribe, it's free. So, yeah. And also, I do have some good news. I'm going to be launching a new series starting next week that will be called Tractor Talk with L&N Productions, which will be much like this series, only it will be focused on tractors and other agricultural things, such as tractors, implements, combines, anything. Maybe some semis in there. I don't know. But until we meet again, somewhere out there in the high iron, this is L&N Productions.